And this presentation builds really well on what Anne was just talking about, actually. So how can we continue to augment the flows that are happening in the river through unregulated flows, environmental water, and use infrastructure to continue to look after the environment. It's a Good Institute project that we're 9 months into, so I'll start out by apologising and saying this is a what we're going to do talk, not a look at all of our great results talk. But it's a big multidisciplinary project. All those people up there who I won't go through, but trying to tie together all the different responses we're interested in rather than just focusing on one individual little piece. So I'll lay out the challenge, I guess, we're looking at, the problem we're trying to help inform, and what we're looking at as we go through the project. As an example, and this builds on Anne's introduction as well, this is some work done as part of the South Australian Floodplain Integrated Infrastructure Program work. I think Marty Montezeri did it actually. And we're looking at the pre-basin plan inundation on the floodplain. This is the Pike floodplain, but just nothing specific about that, it's just an illustration. And the colours are how frequently each bit of the floodplain got wet for 60 days as a return interval. So the green there is 1 in 4 years. The yellowy, orangey yellows are 1 in 6 years, 1 in 7 years. So that's pretty much saying anything out of the channel, and the main Murray is, my pointer works, no, main Murray's on the western side there. Anything out of there is wet, 1 in 4 years, right on the edge, 1 in 6 years, 1 in 7 years beyond that. And that's, like Anne was saying, for the vegetation out there, that's pretty infrequent. As we go to basin plan, one of the basin plan scenarios we can look at, you can see the frequency increases definitely. Some more green and more light blue and green out on the floodplain now, but still the fairly close floodplain. Not getting to those high elevation sort of black box that Anne was talking about. If we compare that to natural, you can see there's that light blue, that 1 in 3, covering quite a large part of the floodplain there. So even though we're implementing a basin plan, it's doing a lot, changing, from water not getting out onto the floodplain very much to more frequently. The objective of the basin plan was a healthy working river. It's not go back to natural. So there's still more we can do, like Anne was talking about with the pumping, and I'll go the right way. So here on the Pike floodplain, the SARFIP program is also building infrastructure so we can hold water back on that floodplain, inundate it more frequently, to start trying to replace some of that natural inundation that we expect would have happened. So now we don't need the 60,000 meg a day or more that would have required that inundation to happen. We could do it with much lower flows and use the blocking bank in pink there and some regulators to hold that water back on the floodplain. And then it lines up relatively well with the natural one of what we could do. So that's great if you're a tree or something like that, like Anne was talking about. Just add water, as she said. We know it's more complicated than that, but that's the objective, to put water out for vegetation. If we look at that, where that circle is there, a photo on Tanika Creek, that's it. That's where, and you can see the vegetation, really quite stressed. And the regulator's going just, here basically. It's going to be built. So we'll be able to take that, use that structure, and before I get to that, so we can control the flow flowing through this ana branch, but generally for a given flow volume per time, that might be going relatively quickly through this little ana branch in terms of how fast the water's moving, meters per second, the velocity. But if we come along and use our structure, we can raise the water level up, inundate that vegetation, but the trade-off for that is with the same discharge in that same volume of water, the velocity and how fast it's moving through that bigger area is slower. So if you're a tree, that scenario is good. You're wet now when you weren't before. But if you're in the river and you're a fish or a little zooplankton or something like that requires that faster moving water for part of your life stage, then we may be having negative consequences as we do this. So that's really the driver for this project. We are building all these structures where we can to help augment the inundation. We've had Chowler regulator for I think 4 years now. We're building this one here at Pike and another one the next downstream at Catarapco. We're looking at manipulating weir pools and raising them up and lowering them down to increase the inundation we can, augment the flows and get that water out in the floodplain. But the thing we don't understand as well is what is that going to do in the channels. So part of it is just that habitat question of how fast is the water moving and do different species need that? And the other part of it is, well, as we wet the floodplain and bring water levels back down again, we're bringing a whole heap of carbon and energy and nutrients back into the river. And that can be a good thing if it goes into the right parts of the food web. It can drive a lot of productivity, going from phytoplankton to zooplankton and creating fish food. That's a really good outcome. But if we get it not quite as right, it can lead to some negative consequences as well, and having algal blooms and hypoxic blackwater events and things like that. So we're really looking to try and understand how we can do these operations and maximise the benefits and minimise the chance of some of those risks happening. So that's the context for the project. The individual parts we're looking at, I mentioned hypoxic blackwater, and that happened during the last big flood, the end of 2016. That's Murray Cod in Rufus River, and that's happening when we have, in the 2016 event, it was that parts of the floodplain upstream hadn't been wet for 20, 30 years. We inundated all of a sudden, a whole heap of organic carbon came back into the river. As that breaks down, it uses up oxygen to the extent where there's not much left for the critters living there. So we're trying to predict that. There's been a lot of work in this space over the last 10 years, but the addition now is linking that up across sites to be able to look at the effect of an upstream site on a downstream site, and as we start to have more and more of these sites being operated. We're also looking at the abundance of phytoplankton, that question I talked about of the bad algal blooms potentially occurring. Again, this happens in the river, maybe not regularly, but it happens. In June 2016 there was quite a lot of cyanobacteria alerts, so it's the potentially harmful toxin producing cyanobacteria. You can also just have sort of nuisance sort of algae outbreaks that might not be as harmful, but still get in the way of water treatment and things like that. So again, trying to understand the conditions that will lead to these sorts of outbreaks so that we can avoid them. So that's one part, but also can we try and encourage the good phytoplankton to occur, so the more nutritious diatoms and things like that will feed up the food chain. How can we try and switch things so that they'll be there to kick off the food chain rather than these harmful algal blooms? Quite a big piece of the project is looking at proper gill transport, so that means things like Murray cod larvae there, zooplankton, plant seeds, the things that are part of a species life stage that require this water moving to go through their life history. So if we're doing this and using structures and slowing water down, we want to avoid slowing it down so much that these things drop out of the water column and then we're interrupting what they're up to. So there was quite a lot of field work happening last spring and summer where we were in the Chala Anna branch. There it is there. And we can control the flow coming in through Pike Plains, Tanika Creek there. So we could look at changing the hydraulic conditions in the Anna branch, pushing around the outside there, and be out there trying to catch these things and see when we found them and when we didn't, to see if they were dropping out as we moved down the Anna branch and as the water was getting slower and slower. So that's was quite an extensive lot of field work happening, and it's sort of being processed now to look at those relationships between the hydraulics that we were somewhat controlling and what we were finding in the water. So this is sort of some work in progress of trying to come up with these curves of how slow is too slow, how much water do we need to keep flowing through the creeks, and then the rest we can push out on the floodplains. So the Murray cod larvae is the one we're looking at, and also different types of zooplankton, and also the catching some plant seeds on the banks through sardi guys. And the last part of the project is trying to tie it all together. So as I said, we're looking at inundating these floodplains, bringing energy sources back into the river, and then what the in-channel conditions are like will determine what happens next. So what's the community that's there to make use of that energy, that carbon, those nutrients, and will that move up a productive part of the food chain, or will that just lead to a big algal bloom? So ultimately that's what we're trying to do, using isotopes to track that carbon through the food chain, through the sampling that goes on, plus going out and catching a few other yabbies and things like that to track the carbon through the food web to see if what we hope is happening, and the sort of standard model of a food web there, or are we just sort of creating algal blooms? And Nina is giving a presentation on what's happening here in a couple of weeks. So if you're interested in that, definitely head along. And finally, we don't just want to go and do a heap of science and things. We want to actually make this useful. That was a big driver for this project and in the department. So ultimately, we want to take all this monitoring and the relationships that it come up with and build them into some of the tools we have for managing flows in the river to be able to look at those if-then scenarios of if we operate this structure and that structure, what sort of response can we expect? So to try and avoid those risks and maximise the benefits. So this is saying, I won't run through it all, running out of time, but basically we can control the infrastructure and we can to some extent influence flow at the border with environmental water and other things. Use the hydraulics, they're the real driver here, the velocities and water levels. Other things like temperature and antecedent conditions that it will be important, and then relate that information to the responses we're trying to map. So to sum all that up, through all parts of the basin we're using infrastructure to enhance those ecological outcomes compared to what we're doing through just flow and through basin plan and a lot of other bigger initiatives. But as we start messing with that and messing with nature, it becomes much more complicated. So that's really where this research fits in, to try and understand some of those responses so we can evaluate those trade-offs and try and avoid bad things happening. And I will flag this as sort of feeds into a much bigger project looking at this cumulative operation as part of SAFIP, the Environmental Pathways Project. Thank you.